Hello and welcome to my second tips and tricks tutorial for the dForce magnet. In this tutorial I'm going to show you how you can make the figure drop the fabric so it floats down in a natural way, and how you can make this work within one single animation. I have here this scene which you may remember from the promo videos on the product page, and in this animation the figure picks up the dress and holds it for a while. Okay, let's look at the scene setup. I have my figure here in 0 pose. Let's select her. Okay, and you can see I have several keyframes on my timeline. The first 30 frames were not visible in the rendered animation because I used them only to move the figure into the starting pose for picking up her fabric. So my render started here at frame 30. And she moves into position to pick up the fabric at frame 51 and moves into the final pose at frame 90. And the rest until frame 120 is just for the fabric to settle, and she just turns her head to smile into the camera. Now I want her to drop the fabric as soon as she has picked it up, here in frame 90, so it uses the remaining frames to float down and settle on her leg again. And I want to do that all within one scene file without having to stitch together the final animation. We need to use a trick for that, because that studio cannot switch things on and off during the animation, so I cannot activate or deactivate the magnet. I'm going to use a second copy of this pareo to create the effect I want. So let's move back to frame 0, and I go here and select the pareo, and I go to Edit, Duplicate, Duplicate Nodes. This creates a copy of the pareo as it is in this frame. It uses the same morphs. If we check what I have currently used here, I have several widen and fit morphs. And when I check the copy has these morphs active too, but it doesn't have the magnet attached. Now what I want to do is to use the first copy of the pareo until frame 90, and from 91 onwards I want to use the second copy without the magnet attached, so the fabric floats down. As I said, we can't switch things on and off along the timeline during an animation, so I'm using a different method to make things visible and invisible. And the easiest method is to use the scaling. I select my main pareo, the one with a magnet attached, and I go to frame 91. This is the first frame where I want it to be invisible. And I'll go to my parameters tab, and I set the scaling to 0. When the scaling is 0, it's so tiny that it's practically invisible. And I do the opposite. And now I check at frame 90. What we see now is the second copy, so I make that invisible for the moment. It's we can see in frame 90, so we can see in frame 90 it's still invisible, the main item, because the scale is really practically 0, and that is because that studio calculates between 100% scale at the beginning of the animation to 0% scale at frame 91. So we are practically at 0 in frame 90. But I want it to be visible, fully visible, here in this frame. So I change that to 100. And as you can see, there is some interpolation going on, because for some reason that Studio does not really accept two keyframes with the same value right after each other. So I have here 100% scaling and I have here 100% scaling, and it thinks it needs to do some changes in between those two, so it goes beyond the 100%. In this case, I just go here, check my use limits and set that to 100%. So it can't go any higher. And it has created a keyframe here. I can delete that, I don't need that. Now when I scrub the slider, you can see that it remains at 100%. And it's at 0% in frame 91, so it's invisible. Now I do the same with the opposite settings with the second edition of the Pareo. So I set that to 0% size in frame 90 and 100% size in frame 91. And I'm going to check how it looks at the beginning of the animation. Right, it has remembered that it's at 100% scaling in the very first frame, in frame 0, and for a reason I will explain later, I want it to be at 100% in frame 0. I want it invisible in frame 1, so I go to frame 1 and scale it down to 0. And of course, again, that Studio interpolates the scaling during the animation, which I don't want. So again, I go here, use limits, and I set the minimum limit to 0%. So it can't go below 0, which it did before. Let's check this again. Right, so let me repeat. It's at 100% scale in frame 0 and at 0% scale in frame 1, and it remains tiny and invisible until frame 91, where it has 100% scaling again and is visible again. In exchange, the main item with the magnet attached works the other way around. It's visible all the time until frame 90, and then it gets invisible. So if I scrub this slider, you will notice that this jumps down to the original position. Now I only have to make her hold this fabric, and I'm going to use a morph for that. To create the base data for this morph, I go to frame 90, where I have my draped Pareo active, and I select that, and it has the shape I want that Studio to use for this falling down action. And now I have to hide everything else, all the other objects, so I have only the clothing itself in the scene. So I have to hide the figure and her eyelashes. It's important. It's easy to overlook those. I have to hide the magnet that's attached to the dress, the bikini, both parts, the second Pareo, of course, because even if it's tiny, it's still present in the scene, and the hair and the backdrop. I can leave the light because that doesn't have any geometry. If I had any other objects in the scene, I would have to hide those too. Now I go to File, Export, and I choose a name, for example, fabric picked up. And I make sure I remember which setting I've used here. In this case, it's the .studio setting, where 1 unit equals 1 centimeter. Accept. Right. Now I can make everything visible again. And I move to frame 91, where this pareo is tiny and practically invisible, and my main item is the second edition of the pareo. And I select that one, and I go here to the Morph Loader Pro icon. I click it and I make sure I have the same setting I used previously, .studio, and I choose my morph files from the location where I've exported the file previously. I double click this and I go down here to Reverse Deformations, right click and set it to Yes. Accept. Morph created successfully. OK. Now we only need to make it active, and it appears in the Parameters tab in the Morph sections. And I dial it in now. And I go back to the previous frame and switch it off there. I don't want it active before, I want it active here in frame 91. Okay, so this pareo has the same shape as the other one that has the magnet attached. You can see that's the other one, the magnet is visible. When I scrub this line, you don't see the switch where one object, one dress is exchanged for the other. But it is a different dress, a different object without the magnet attached. So when I start the simulation now, there is no magnet to hold up this part of the fabric, so it will fall down naturally. One problem with using morphs like this is that dForce tends to remember the shape of the fabric. So it would remember that here this bit of fabric is pulled out and has a sort of peak. And this would be visible even when the fabric is down. It would create a weird sort of lump in the fabric. To avoid that, I've set up this animation with the frame 0 in the original shape. If you remember, let me go to General Settings. I've set it up so that it's at 100% size in frame 0, and it's at 0 size only in frame 1. That is because I use the frame 0 as an indication for .studio which shape to use as base shape. And I go here, I still have the second pareo selected. I go here to General, Simulation, and I don't use the simulation start frame, I use scene frame 0. So I make sure it's using this neutral, natural shape without this bit of fabric pulled out. And I go again to my frame 91. I select the first pareo, and to protect the simulation I have on this one, I use this button here, Free Simulation On. Now when I calculate the simulation for the second item, this simulation will remain unchanged. And I also go to Display and make it invisible for the simulation, because even if it's tiny, the geometry is present, the geometry is visible, even if very, very small, and it would make the simulation take longer if it had to take into account this geometry of the first pareo. I also switch off all the other items which I've added after the first simulation, so they are invisible in the simulation. So for example, the eyelashes and the hair. Hair can slow down a simulation tremendously because it has a lot of geometry, which is all included in the calculation, even if it's far from the item itself. And the backdrop, off. Okay. Now I have here my Pariah shoulder number 2, the second one, and I go to my simulation settings tab, and instead of using the animated use timeline play range, I switch it to animated custom, and I'm setting it up to calculate the simulation from frame 91 to frame 120. And now I start my simulation, and while it's running I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, I'm back. The simulation took 48 seconds, and here it is. The fabric is nicely draped around her shape. Now when I check how it looks like, so this is still the first Pariah with the magnet attached. She picks up the fabric and drops it. And you can see that the fabric settles in a natural way. And it does not create any lumps here in the spot where the fabric was picked up previously. Now all I have to do to make it believable is to change her hand's position, so she opens her fingers in the moment she drops the fabric, and I have the effect I wanted. And I have it all together in one scene. I did not have to stitch any animations. I did not have to create 2 separate files. It's all contained within this single scene. And when I start the animation, you can see that it plays smoothly, and you do not even notice where the 2 dresses are switched. I could now render out the animation starting with frame 30 as I did before, or even starting at frame 1. The only thing to remember is that I should leave out frame 0, because in frame 0 I have both Pariahs visible. This is where I set up the base shape for the second simulation, so I would have to start rendering at frame 1. That's the only thing I have to remember in this case. I hope you found this tutorial useful, and thanks for watching.